So, having looked at French and German World War One tanks that I'd like to see added to War Thunder, it's now time to take a look at the British tanks, and these are probably the sort of tanks most people associate with World War One. These being large, heavy tanks with their armament housed in side-mounted sponsons, and with tracks that go around the whole tank. And we will be looking at these designs today, as well as some other designs that were used by Britain during World War One. So we'll start off chronologically with the first British tank to enter service, the Mark I, which first went into action on the 15th of September 1916 during the Somme offensive. Now, when it comes to British heavy tanks, you should bear in mind that there were two variants. There would be the male tanks that were fitted with two 6-pounder guns in the sponsons, as well as machine guns elsewhere, while the female tanks had only 6 machine guns in the sponsons and elsewhere. So on the Mark I, there was the two 57mm 6-pounder guns and then 4 machine guns. So the 6-pounder guns were ex-naval guns, and they weren't specifically designed for anti-tank work. But they should still perform decently enough against enemy tanks, whether they are firing HE or solid shot shells, because tanks during this period weren't particularly heavily armoured, so they should manage against enemy tanks. And bearing that in mind, it is easy to imagine with this tank weighing 28 tons, that it must be fitted with heavy armour. But the reality is that the armour doesn't really go beyond 10 to 12mm, which is more than enough when protecting against regular small arms fire, but would struggle against large HE shells or dedicated armour-piercing bullets and shells. And on the Mark I, there are some design choices which do make it a little bit more vulnerable. For example, there are two 25-gallon fuel tanks fitted in the nose of the tank. So, of course, if they're hit, then you're probably going to have a big fire or possibly explosion. And at the rear of the sponsons, there is a little gap for dropping out spent shell cases. So in-game, if you pop a HE shell there, it's going to explode and, obliterate anyone in the sponson and possibly destroy the entire tank. And in real life, according to the Tank Museum, during the first battle that the tanks were used in, a German soldier bayoneted a tank crew member through this gap, which is absolutely insane, and I have to wonder what was going through that man's mind when he decided to, bayonet a tank and actually successfully do so. Or, at least one of the crew members. You might also notice in some of the pictures that some of them are fitted with a wooden roof with chicken wire, and basically this was used to keep out grenades, but if it was included in game it would probably be a bit of a disadvantage because it might set off HE shells, allowing for quick roof kills, so I suspect they should be added without the wooden roofs. Now, suffice to say, due to the weight and the use of a 105 horsepower petrol engine, it does have a very slow top speed of only 3.7 miles per hour or 6 kilometers an hour, which, coupled with a power-to-weight ratio of only 3.7 horsepower a tonne, would cause the Mark I to struggle when getting around the map. So it should do fairly well at crossing shell-strewn terrain, because of course that is one of the types of terrain it was designed to beat. You may also notice that the Mark Is have a wooden tail assembly at the back, which were used to steer the tank, and could be lifted clear of the ground by hydraulics if you wanted to, but as it turns out they basically were never needed and they weren't fitted to future designs. Lastly, a crew of 8 was required to man the Mark I, with the driver and commander up front, with the commander assisting in driving, 2 gearsmen at the back of the tank to actually steer it, and then 2 crew for each of the 6-pounder guns. I'm not entirely sure how the gearsmen would be implemented in-game. I assume they would just be labelled as generic gunners or radio operators, because I can't imagine it would be very fun to be immobilised after 1 or 2 of them have been knocked out. So I think in the game it would just work as, as if only the driver was needed to operate the vehicle. So when added to War Thunder, I could see this being a 0.3 tank, because of course it is a bit of a glass cannon in that it has very powerful 6-pounder guns, but does suffer a little bit in regards to armour, plus its very slow speed. But low mobility is a common problem amongst most World War I tanks, and if they designed, World War I specific maps where there would be very harsh terrain, it would probably do a little bit better than other tanks. And overall, I think it would be a popular tank once players get used to operating the twin armament, and it would be nice to see the first operational tank available and given some attention in War Thunder. So Britain had developed and was ready to deploy this new and devastating weapon, which of course the Germans didn't have that many countermeasures for, except for firing over open sights with artillery guns, or using some of the very rare armour-piercing bullets. However, Britain then committed a bit of a blunder by deploying the tank pretty early on at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. So only 32 tanks were available to take part in the battle, and while they did manage to achieve a small local victory, it also sent a massive, loud and clear signal for the Germans to start developing countermeasures. For example, giving out more armour-piercing bullets, developing dedicated anti-tank weapons, and even small actions like widening trenches, because of course if the trench is wider than the tank, then the tank will have a lot of trouble crossing it. And like I said, it was a bit of a blunder because France had warned against deploying the tanks until both nations had large numbers of tanks to use. Obviously, the idea was to force a breakthrough, end the trench warfare, and hopefully bring back a return to mobile warfare. And by the time Germany would have developed countermeasures to deal with these new tanks, hopefully a great victory would have been achieved. But like I say, they were deployed early, and so this didn't happen. And so future British and French tanks would have to deal with a much more prepared enemy. And overall, only 150 Mark 1s were built, and then work started on new designs. So the next two tanks were the Mark II and Mark III, which were intended as training tanks. The Mark IIs were made of unarmoured steel, but a few were sent to the Battle of Arras in 1917 due to a shortage of tanks, but the Mark III was just used for training, so I don't think those two tanks could be added. But we're now going to skip ahead to the Mark IV, which was the first mass-produced tank, and could be considered a bit of a minor upgrade to the Mark I. So the armour has been somewhat improved, not really thickened as such with regards to the maximum armour, but now 8mm armour extends further back along the sides compared to the previous tank, and this gives much better protection. And as such, the Mark IVs are now practically immune to the new German armour-piercing K bullets that had been issued to deal with the Mark Is. The internal front-mounted fuel tanks have also been moved to the exterior of the rear of the tank, and that's in its own armoured 70-gallon container, so now there is a much reduced risk of fire or explosions from the fuel tank being hit. However, when it comes to the armament, there has potentially been some big changes, as while the Mail tanks are still fitted with two 57mm 6-pounder guns, these have shortened barrels at only 23 calibers long compared to 40 calibers long for the original 6-pounders. And basically this was done because the original barrels were found to be too long and would catch on terrain and other objects, and so the barrels were shortened to mitigate this. So in theory this should result in a much lower muzzle velocity, but according to my main source, the original guns used smaller charges when firing, while the new barrels could use larger charges, which apparently essentially cancelled out any loss of muzzle velocity from the shorter barrels. And so they still have a penetration of 30mm at 450 metres, more than enough to knock out most World War I tanks, while HE shells and canister shot are also available. Meanwhile, 3 Lewis machine guns were also carried, 1 for each flank and 1 for the front. And if issued with AP rounds, these could cause issues for most enemies, including thinly armoured tanks. Lastly, the mobility should be practically the same as the Mark I at 3.7 miles per hour or 6 kilometers an hour, while the crew complement remains 8, so no real differences here. In War Thunder, I would again place this at 0.3, as it isn't a massive step up from the Mark I, but should still provide useful service for players at the very early battle ratings, and should be a little bit more survivable compared to the earlier Mark I. In real life, 1,220 Mark IVs were built, and they would serve from May 1917 until the end of the war and beyond, even taking part in the first tank v tank battle against a German A7V. Ultimately, though, the Mark IVs would slowly be replaced by newer models as time went on, and they were considered obsolete by the end of the war. Interestingly, one of the battles that the Mark IVs took part in large numbers, the Battle of Cambrai, resulted in a lot of these tanks being abandoned and recovered by the Germans, who had also become a major user of this tank, with at least 30 recovered and used by them. But moving on from the Mark IV, we now come to the Mark V, of which there are a few variants, and basically this would introduce more improvements over the Mark IV while retaining many of the existing features. The first big difference you will notice is the new 150 horsepower Ricardo petrol engine, which is quite an improvement compared to the old 105 horsepower engine, giving it a faster top speed, which is now 4.6 miles per hour or 7.4 kilometers an hour, as well as having more power available when crossing tough terrain. A new system for steering was also introduced, allowing the driver to steer the tank independently without the use of the gearsman, who are now freed up for other duties within the tank, while the commander is now in a cab at the rear of the tank rather than with the driver up front, potentially reducing casualties in the event of a frontal penetration. Other than this, its stats are about the same as the Mark IV, with the same two 57mm 6-pounder guns and 4 Hotchkiss machine guns, one for the front, each flank and the rear of the tank. I would again place this at about 0.3, as again, this is an improvement, but it's not a wholesale improvement over the previous tanks, still being fairly slow and having broadly the same armour and armament. But again, it could make a good vehicle to use, and I think should be the start of a folder of vehicles, because of course there are other variants we will look at in a second. So the Mark V wouldn't be deployed until July 1918, and does seem to have been pretty successful, though by this time trench warfare was ending, and the war itself would be over in just a few months. Though they would see service after the war in various locations like the Allied intervention in Russia, and due to their use in the intervention in Russia, this is where many of them still survive to this day. There would be at least 2 variants of the Mark V called the Mark V Star and the Mark V Double Star, with the Mark V Star having a longer length, allowing it to cross trenches of up to 4 metres wide, compared to the 3 metres of the original Mark V, though at the cost of increasing the weight of the tank to 33 tonnes. Interestingly, up to 15 infantry and 4 machine guns could also now be carried into battle in the tank, though this didn't tend to work out due to the harsh conditions within the tank severely impacting their ability to fight upon exiting the tank. And so I doubt they would be modelled in-game, though if they could, having a few extra crew members would be handy. The Mark V Double Star was also lengthened, but was also fitted with an even more powerful 225 horsepower petrol engine, no doubt giving it a better top speed and acceleration, and it was also fitted with wider tracks to improve the ground pressure of the tank, while more mounts for machine guns were fitted throughout the tank. So these 2 vehicles probably should be folded with the Mark V, and again they would probably be added at 0.3 or possibly 0.7, because again, an improvement but not a massive game changer compared to the previous tanks. Like even compared to the Mark I, we've still got the same armament, slightly improved armour, and only slightly faster, as well as the same crew members. So the Star variant wouldn't be deployed until very late in the war, much like the Mark V, while the Double Star wouldn't enter service until after the war and was only used in small numbers. There would subsequently be a Mark VII developed, but only a few of these were built, and it seems to have been more of a testbed for various systems. So the last of the heavy tanks to actually be developed and enter service was the Mark VIII, also known as the International or Liberty tank, which was a heavy tank developed jointly by Britain and the United States, with the idea that this would be a common tank used by the British, French and American armies, though the British and American versions would have some differences between them. The design itself was actually pretty good, though it wasn't finished until after the war, but it finally did away with the male and female variants of the tanks, instead being a universal tank with all of them armed with 2 57mm 6-pounder guns and up to 7 Hotchkiss machine guns, these being mounted in the main turret area at the top of the tank and 2 in each flank of the hull, providing a good all-round field of fire except at the immediate rear of the tank, but this was solved by basically fitting a deflector plate, so the rear machine gunner would fire at that deflector plate and it would deflect bullets into the area, allowing the rear machine gunner to hit targets that they couldn't actually see. The Mark IV now has a 300 horsepower engine, double that of the Mark V and 200 horsepower more than the original Mark I, giving it a top speed of 5.2 miles per hour or 8.3 kilometers an hour. Still slow, but much better than the previous models, and it has 2 gears when going forward and 1 gear in reverse, and a length of 34 feet or 10.3 metres, almost the same as the Mark V Star. Unfortunately, it now weighs in at 40 tonnes, though it has much wider tracks to help offset this, while the armour should be broadly the same as previous models, maxing out at around 16mm. Lastly, the crew complement is still 8, with the driver at the front and the rest of the crew high up in the superstructure or manning the main armament in the sponsons. So ultimately, the Mark VIII was a very successful joint design, but unfortunately it was too late to see service during World War I, with only a few of them built and used by Britain, though the Americans would build over 100 of these and they would be in service until the 1930s. In War Thunder, I would suggest placing this at around 0.7, as it now has a fairly decent speed and acceleration, while still retaining the excellent armament and good coverage by machine guns, which again could cause issues for enemies if they're issued AP rounds. And it would be nice for this often forgotten tank to get some recognition in game. So as we can see, there are plenty of British heavy tanks for us to use, though the designs themselves, while suited to the trench warfare of World War I, would have fared less well in the more mobile warfare of later years, and they were practically obsolete by 1920. However, Britain did develop a few medium tank designs, which were capable of much faster speeds and better suited to mobile warfare. Unfortunately, these were all machine gun armed tanks, but we will briefly cover them as, again, they could still do damage with AP rounds, and of course they would work extremely well against unarmoured vehicles. The first of these is the medium Mark A Whippet, which first entered service in 1918, where their high speeds of 8.3 miles per hour or 13.3 kilometers an hour allowed them to quickly move about the battlefield and strike far into the rear of the German lines, including one notable occasion during the Battle of Amiens, where a Whippet tank named Musical Box managed to rampage for many hours in the German rear lines, inflicting heavy damage on a German artillery position, destroying an observation balloon, attacked a transport column, and even inflicted heavy casualties on a German infantry division, before it was finally stopped. And it kind of shows how tough even medium tanks were, the fact it was able to attack all those targets and inflict many heavy casualties before actually finally being stopped. Of course, the armour is light at only 12mm, and the 3-man crew only have 4 Hotchkiss machine guns as armament. But with 4 of these, they have 360-degree field of fire between them, and again with AP rounds, they should be able to pose a threat to the very earliest tanks, though of course later tanks will cause many issues for them. But regardless, this tank would have to be added at 0.0, and I think it would be a decent enough tank at the earliest tiers, but like I say, it would struggle against heavily armoured tanks. There was also a variant of the Whippet capable of a top speed of 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour, which would be insanely fast compared to every other World War I tank, and this could be added as an event or premium vehicle. Following the Whippet, there was then the medium Mark B and C. Both tanks were built in very few numbers, only 100 or so for the Mark B and 50 for the Mark C, but these both had a crew of 4 and were capable of top speed of 6 miles per hour and 7.9 miles per hour respectively. So slightly slower than the Whippet, but they were also larger tanks, being longer and heavier than the Whippet, and carried more machine guns, the B having up to 7 and 5 for the C. And again, they had a similar maximum armour thickness to the Whippet. And like the Whippet, they would have to be added at 0.0, and again they would likely have some success, but potentially could play a little bit worse due to their lower speeds compared to the Whippet. But before we finish off completely, we have one last vehicle I would like to look at, the Gun Carrier Mark I, which was a vehicle that was designed to carry 6-inch howitzers or 60-pounder guns across the battlefield, as this was often not possible for wheeled vehicles. However, thankfully for us, the 6-inch howitzer could be fired from the gun carrier, meaning it could be introduced to War Thunder as a primitive tank destroyer or SPG vehicle. The 12-man crew would be somewhat vulnerable to enemy fire due to the openness of the firing platform, but the gun itself would be pretty powerful, able to fire a 100-pound or 45kg HE shell with an explosive content of just under 5 kilograms, which should give it a penetration of around 45 to 50mm, which is more than enough to deal with any World War I era tank and even later tanks. The only problems with this vehicle are its top speed, which is only 3.7 miles per hour or 6 kilometers an hour, and also potentially the amount of depression for the gun, which I wasn't able to find. Either way, if it could be added, I would suggest a better rating of around 0.3 to 0.7, as it is still a pretty powerful vehicle, and it could even be used in an artillery role by those skilled enough to do so. So that's it for this episode looking at British tanks of World War I that I would like to see added to War Thunder. I'd also be interested to hear your views on these vehicles and any other vehicles you would like me to cover. I look forward to reading your comments below. So I hope you've enjoyed the video, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno and I'll see you next time.